Okay, so we're just now is 3 o'clock or whatever time, wherever you are in time zones. Let's wait. I think I already said that this is the ERCST webinar on border carbon adjustment EU, the launch on report of the report of international cooperation on BCAs/CBAMs. So if you think you're somewhere else, then you shouldn't be here, but it is about CBAM and international cooperation. I think it's a very, very current subject and one that is going to amplify as we continue especially the European debate, but also the international debate. What I will do is I will slowly go through this agenda because I have to burn time somehow and introduce myself. My name is Andrei Marcu. I'm the director of ERCST, which is a very long acronym for the European Roundtable on Climate Change and Sustainable Transition. We didn't put this name because we got on the wrong side of the bed or we didn't have anything else to do. We put this name for a very, very precise reason. And that precise reason is that we were concerned about the transition and how the transition would be done. And we were very concerned about it being sustainable. It is a transition that has taken place, transitions that have taken place in other circumstances, in other times, and some of them very recently, Central Eastern Europe, some of it has been well managed, some of it has not been managed at all. So in this context, we saw that sustainable transition is an important element, and the border carbon adjustment and the ability to be ambitious in the face of asymmetric climate policy is something that is preoccupied us from the very beginning. I will not go in the presentation, but as one of the deliverables of our project that I will go into a bit later is the fact that one of the reports out of the 4 deals with international cooperation in the context of border carbon adjustment or CBAM. Today we have a stellar panel. First of all, I have my colleagues that we have worked with in doing this report, and that is Michael Melling, who's somewhere in Upper New York State, and it's not that late, but Aaron Cosby, who is in British Columbia somewhere, and that is very early, and of course Pauline Nollet, and then also our other colleagues, Bente and Elena. So this has been very much a team effort. This report right now is becoming public. I think it's been put on the website, it's being circulated. So yes, it is it's available now. We started the presentation of the report and we tried to make it reasonable in terms of timing and not bore you with all the details, but give you enough of a flavor of what's in the report in such a way as to be able to understand the ideas behind this, because again, we are think tank, and think tank should live in the domain of ideas. But then we have a number of stakeholder reactions, and it's Tim Mayer from Duke University School of Law. Tim, welcome. It is reasonable time for you, I guess, on the Eastern Seaboard. Eileen Schokat from Agora Energiewende. Lucas Hermville from the Wuppertal Institute, and we were supposed to also be joined by Makane Mbenge from the University of Geneva. I have made it earlier that Makane has confirmed and has been in touch with us a week ago or so, and now he's somewhat AWOL and we cannot find him. I'm not sure what is going on. All I know, there's some kind of an open week at the WTO, I think, Aaron in Geneva. So he may be wondering the holes of the WTO for all I know, and something else is taken priority. But in any case, he is not here. We apologize on our behalf and his behalf because he hasn't been able to be here. Having said all this, I think we're 5 minutes into our session, and what we'd like to do is to start with the presentation. Again, we try to make this global, and we try to bring people, invite people from around the world. In some cases, at the beginning of this process, when webinars on Zoom and what have you were invented, I think there was an eager audience. I think the audience now has been segmented. It's like in any market, there's more like TV channels. There's a lot of TV channels, so they have a lot of choice. So we will now proceed with our presentation, and I will start. We will do a bit of a ballet. Again, it'll be myself and then Aaron and Michael. And if Pauline wants to intervene, by all means, I mean, she's here with us, and happy for her to signal to that she wants to intervene. So now let's move on to the first slide. And this is a bit of a kind of kitchen stuff, in the sense that, you know, ERCST is doing this since the beginning, since this was first announced by the President von der Leyen, and it has 3 phases. There were phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 of the CBAM project. Again, we try to diversify the support. You've seen who the supporters are of this project, and we made this very, very transparent. But the third phase really was focused on 4 deliverables. One of them was treatment of, 2 of them were very focused on discrete issues that were very much hot topics, red lines, whatever you want to call it, in the debate in the European legislative process. Treatment of export in the CBAM, indirect emission in the CBAM. Now, this is the third one. And this third report gives an overview of international cooperation and the role of BCAs and how BCAs fit in this salad. And this is context and rationale for cooperation, different degrees of cooperation, and viability of a club option for BCA cooperation. So we're trying to look at option, and we try to do a judgment, to put our judgment as to how this would work. Let's move on, because I think we have quite a few slides ahead of us. Now, I'm not going to say again too much on this, because you guys know this stuff, and all that needs to be said is that BCA had not been the favorite baby for a long time, because people thought it would contravene WTO, and it's too complex. The EU gave it an impulse and became the flavor of the day. It overtook the ETS as the thing that you love to hate. And the fact that the asymmetry of the Paris Agreement is also pushing this, because yes, you have the Paris Agreement and everybody applauds it, but the Paris Agreement is enshrining a asymmetrical climate change policy with people doing different things. Everybody, in principle, the Paris Agreement, everybody will do what they can in the way they can, and now they will tell the world how they do it, and then we'll move forward. But that's the principle. How it's being now changed is a different story. Now, the international cooperation in terms of context also, what has been the reaction? Because we're talking about the international context, and we've seen from many parties measures to try to adapt. You have seen people trying to bring together, to put in place things of measures like ETSs and so on to adapt to a CBAM. To understand the implication impact, I mean, initially it was, it actually caught quite rapidly, and we had a lot of demands for people saying, so what does this mean for me? What does this mean to me? So from our side, we've done a number of studies for a number of countries, examining the possibility of putting in place their own CBAM, with the UK, Canada, the US in some way, examining international cooperation as a context. There's been resistance. It's not the kind of vocal and really, really, this is a hill to die on, ICAO type of aviation type of reaction that we had when the stop the clock was introduced. But it's there. It's there, and it's there in WTO, and you heard, it's a little more visible. In the UNFCCC, it's a little bit more muted, but it's there. Will it become more vocal when there is something to shoot at? I can't tell you, because I don't know what the books of the various negotiators in WTO and UNFCCC are. Let's move on. Now, why there's interest, and again, it is in order to do your NDCs, you do your things at home, and You talk about international cooperation. There's Article 6 that it's trying to international cooperation of different kinds, including through markets. But there's also unilateral measures, and this is a little article in there, but for some it's not very little. And one that deals with unilateral measures, which are addressed under Article 415 under response measure of the Paris Agreement. Now, when you talk about international cooperation, you can do many things. International cooperation for technology, international cooperation, capacity building, they've got committees coming out of my ears. So there are all kinds of objectives. But one of them is clearly in dealing with carbon leakage and competitive pressure resulting in carbon leakage as a result of asymmetric climate policy. That is one of the things that people are thinking. And this is especially important for the energy-intensive trade-exposed industries because they are highly traded, and cooperation will reduce trade frictions. We have had people think, and I come as former CEO of AIDA, the International Emission Trading Association, the initial holy grail is that we will have a global carbon price, and by God, we're all going to be happy. And that has been somewhat elusive. 20 years later, I did my first workshop in Rue de Bellefeuille at Lafarge when Chris Boyd was the guy. And we talk about linking, and we didn't have anything to link with anything, but we talk about linking. 20 years later, we linked to the Swiss. Well, it's not exactly earth-shattering. It's a success. But 20 years later, you'd had hoped that there would be more in terms of. So that led to looking for other solutions in a way. That is leading. And what Article 6, maybe Article 6.8, non-market approaches, it's another possibility. Let's move on. Now, the other thing that is the fact that you have uncertainty, how people will react. So you really prefer, rather than just getting into a food fight, you prefer to have international cooperation because you have two places where this can pop up. One is WTO, the other one is under UNFCCC, under pressure, but under many other files. And it can show up, and it has showed up, but not in a dramatic way. The other thing is that, for instance, in the EU, in designing the CBAM, there's a lot of pressure. These are degrees of risk. And if you have a CBAM, you don't know if they're going to be challenged, and you don't know if the challenge is going to be successful. But you start introducing exports, the probability of being challenged, and the unknown of how successful it will be, I think increases, the risk increases. So the fact that you try to introduce these things really makes it international cooperation more important. And then there is the last part here, the last part about cooperation modalities of CBAM, where people are looking at accounting standards and reporting requirements to facilitate trade and try to coordinate and avoid the uncoordinated approach. Next, please. And next, please, is Aaron Cosby. You have the floor, sir.
Thanks, Andre, and thanks for setting up the discussion so well. Can I note just on a technical matter that the viewer, the participant view of this screen cuts off at about 3/4 of the width of the screen, so we're not seeing all of the text. I haven't seen this before in a Zoom presentation, so I'm not sure what the problem is, and I'm not sure how to solve it, but we're not getting all of the screen.
I don't know. There was an old movie, an old song, C'est moi non plus. I remember that one, but it was in a different context. So I don't know how to do that. I think that there's probably way.
Yeah, we'll try again.
I would let the young techie people that I know this stuff.
Is it better now?
Yes, that is better. Excellent.
All right, great.
All right, so I'm going to talk about three ways in which we could envision border carbon adjustment as part of an international cooperation scheme, and they are progressively more integrated. They start with a very loose form of integration and cooperation and become more integrated, more cooperative. If we could go to the next, the first type of cooperation we can see possible on border carbon adjustment starts from the assumption that we would like international agreement on what makes sense, what is a fair way to implement border carbon adjustment, what is best practice in some sense, but acknowledges that we're not going to get agreement on a single type of border carbon adjustment that everybody should apply, because border carbon adjustment is fundamentally an accompaniment to an underlying carbon pricing scheme in the domestic context. And as Andre has noted, we have different types of underlying carbon pricing schemes in every country. Those differences are fundamental, so what we can do, however, is at an international level agree to what principles and what best practices could characterize border carbon adjustment. And those principles and best practices could be applied at the national level in the countries that adhere to that agreement in such a way that the national schemes, while they don't look identical from country to country, all follow good practice in elaborating and implementing that border carbon adjustment. So this is a very, as I said, a loose form of cooperation, which allows for very different practice at each national level in countries that are implementing a border carbon adjustment, but it does have some value. For one thing, it helps counter what is inherently a problem with any kind of national legislation. They will usually be more influenced by national vested interests that try to push them toward a domestic protective character. If we have international agreement, we can help counter that tendency. As well, that kind of agreement, if we have it, might help to temper international opposition to unilateral border carbon adjustment, because other countries may to some extent acknowledge that it is being carried out in a fair way. We have put it in place in alignment with commonly agreed rules of fair play. So on to the next slide, please. So some example of the kinds of principles and best practices we have in mind, and I don't want to get into these in depth because then we started a discussion on, I would love to have a discussion on what the principles should be and what best practice should be, but I don't think that's the point here. But just as an illustrative list of principles and best practice that such an agreement could encompass, the agreement could specify that border carbon adjustment is about leakage protection. It is not about protecting domestic industry. It is not about beating up your trading partners with a stick. It is not about raising revenues. It is about protection against leakage. We could have a principle that says revenues from border carbon adjustment should be shared with those countries that are affected. We could have a principle that says credit should be given in the adjustment process for a carbon price paid in the country of export. In terms of best practice, we could demand the use of actual data as opposed to the use of benchmarks for determining the GHG intensity of a good when it shows up at the border. We could have best practice that says, thou shalt not grant national level exemptions on the basis of policy. You're not going to judge other countries' adequacy of national ambition in climate change and therefore give them blanket coverage on that basis. The only exemption should be if a country has a linked ETS, as has been the case in the EU CBAM proposal. Challenges with this kind of cooperation, fundamentally in how you actually get there. It's not obvious where those discussions could be held. And both the WTO and the UNFCCC could lay claim to the legitimacy of convening that kind of a discussion. Neither particularly wants to, because border carbon adjustment is a politically very hot potato. Timing is also an issue. The EU will, before such discussions could begin probably, but certainly before they could conclude, the EU will be out the door with its own version of border carbon adjustment, the CBAM. That could be a good thing, if it's a really good mechanism. It could be the basis around which international cooperation on, or international agreement on best practice coalesces. Or if it's not that good, then it could be a problem in that final guidance might clash with what is already in place. If we could go on to the next slide. The next degree of cooperation would look at what many have characterized as low-hanging fruit. If there is going to be more than one country applying border carbon adjustment, let's have them agree on the standards, the methodologies that are used in the practice of border carbon adjustment. The most obvious one would be, let's agree on what the standard should be for calculating what greenhouse gas is embedded in a product when it shows up at our border. We already have international standards like ISO 14064 and the GHG protocol, which can tell us the greenhouse gas intensity of an activity, a facility, but we don't have yet a widely agreed and appropriate, I would say, standard for calculating the embodied carbon in a good. There are other standards we could imagine for agreement. For example, how do you go about crediting a carbon price in the country of export, especially given that many countries will have exceptions to their carbon price. They'll have an explicit carbon price, and then there will be some sort of a free allowance or tax loophole for those. So how do you arrive at the final calculation of what credit to give in the country to the country of export? The reason this kind of agreement is important is we want to avoid the worst case scenario in which I, as an exporter, am exporting to a bunch of different countries with border carbon adjustment. And for each of those different countries, I have to report to a different protocol. I have to have my GHG certified, verified by an accredited certifier to a different protocol. This is the classic conundrum of standards in international trade. We don't want a whole plethora of standards. We want, to the extent possible, a single standard. That may be unrealistic. Certainly it would have to be sectorally segregated, but to the extent possible, I don't want to have to report to a whole bunch of different standards. Next slide, please. And the final degree of cooperation on border carbon adjustment that we could imagine, and of course these 3 degrees don't encompass the entire universe of possible border carbon adjustment rules and international cooperation. But this final one is, let's go on to the next slide. Already covered this. So the final degree of cooperation would be a climate club, under which all of the countries involved in the club would apply a BCA as a sort of a common external tariff, not unlike what happens under a customs union. So the BCA in this iteration of cooperation can be seen as a stick to, in some sense, punish non-club members, and a carrot to encourage non-club members to become club members. That spares them the application of the border carbon adjustment, also protects them from leakage. If we could go on, the challenges with this type of cooperation, well, they start with the premise that I laid out before. We have very different types of carbon pricing in every different country. We have 35 countries around the world with different kinds of carbon pricing in place, starting with the basic price anywhere from under $1 to over $150. But also what sectors are covered, what kinds of exemptions are allowed, what emissions are covered, even the very basic idea of what's being counted. Is it emissions intensity or is it total emissions, right? And these different schemes are the product of hard-fought political battles in each country. The idea that they could be easily revised in the service of some international agreement is perhaps a little optimistic. Therefore, we're not going to have a common BCA applied by a bunch of countries in the manner that is currently being proposed under the EU until those pricing regimes are harmonized. And I think, as Andre said before, we haven't seen a lot of progress on harmonizing carbon pricing schemes, which means that in any meaningful sense, we can't talk about harmonizing the border carbon adjustment schemes that go along with them.
That's me, Aaron. I'll take over.
Over to Michael.
All right. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Andre. And it's also a pleasure to see for the first time, I think, Eileen and Tim. Of course, I've been on panels before with Lucas, but all virtual. I wish I could be in the room, and all of us could be in the room. But anyhow, so I'll take over from Aaron, and I'll kind of pick up at the ending degree, if you like, that third sort of most intensive degree of cooperation, namely climate clubs. But first, I think we have to say a few words about terminology. And then what I'll try to do is draw on parallels, observations from 20 plus years of cooperation or aspirations to cooperate on carbon pricing to back out whether there may be parallels that bode not so well necessarily for some of the more lofty ideas around BCA cooperation. And Andre already kind of anticipated that by pointing to, for instance, the relatively disappointing progress on linking and integration of separate carbon pricing systems across jurisdictions. So let's go to the next slide. As I said, first, a few words about terminology. There is a relatively, I would say, generous use of the terminology club out there, and that's fine. I think, you know, as long as we sort of know roughly what people are trying to say and they define it, it's okay. But of course, the idea of a club in a more formal sense was born more than half a century ago in the work by Jim Buchanan and others in economic club theory, when they sort of observed that there are non-rivalrous goods like public goods, but that are excludable, unlike public goods. And they focus on things like, you know, from swimming pools, et cetera, all the way to military alliances, customs unions, et cetera, to sort of study what the optimal size of such clubs or coalitions would be, and where congestion starts to eat into the benefits of that club, and really looking at this excludability through, you know, sanctions and also through membership conditions as the definition, as the element of clubs. Now, many of the things that have been bandied around in the last couple of years in the climate cooperation context with the label club would certainly not meet that more formal definition that was developed in club theory many decades ago. And I think Robert Faulkner and co-authors last year had a very nice article in which they come up with sort of a taxonomy that is a little bit broader and tries to absorb and accommodate some of these looser ideas that have been labeled clubs, distinguishing three: normative clubs, bargaining clubs, and transformational clubs. The normative clubs really don't entail negotiation, have no sanctions, penalties, no excludability per se, really open in pursuit of some common goal, some objective, like partnerships to achieve a certain, you know, breakthrough or deployment of hydrogen or of renewable energy or etc. Bargaining clubs, which do add the element of actually trying to facilitate and support formal negotiations towards these shared goals. But it's really only the transformational clubs, sort of the most intensive, if you like, form of club level cooperation that adds this element of excludability with some kind of sanction and some membership, some really formal membership conditions, and usually has to do the whole thing in a more formally binding way. And we think that, you know, joint deployment of BCAs, this sort of third degree of cooperation that Aaron described just in the previous segment of the presentation, that is a transformational club. And that's what we focus on when we now look at what the history of carbon pricing cooperation tells us about the prospects of achieving this kind of club level cooperation. Let's go to the next slide. So in carbon pricing, you know, again, all the way back, again, half a century, you know, some of the earliest reports by Bill Nordhaus in the 70s, you know, there was already this vision that a carbon price, a global carbon price, would of course be the most cost-effective solution to deal with the emerging sort of climate change problem. And this has remained in economic theory, of course, the sort of beacon, the aspirational goal is to have a global, that would be the optimal solution, have a global carbon price at the same level, leveling the abatement costs across all jurisdictions, and really teasing out the benefits of being able to, well, leverage the very heterogeneous abatement costs around the globe in order to reduce the cost of achieving the common target, or of achieving decarbonization more generally. And although, of course, we never were able to enshrine that at the sort of highest level, some sort of global carbon price in an international treaty, it has still sort of come back and resurfaced time and again, especially in the recommendations and in the work capacity building papers, et cetera, of a number of institutions, influential ones at that, like the OECD, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, through various programs, the Partnership for Market Readiness, you know, the network carbon markets, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, the first sort of treaty, the UNFCCC, the first binding legal treaty on climate, didn't include anything like that, but the Kyoto Protocol, it did have a provision that allowed sort of cooperation, but it didn't really speak of using carbon pricing. But the Kyoto Protocol, so to the surprise of some and to the chagrin of others, like the EU, did include market-based mechanisms, and it indeed did include a provision that would enable emissions trading between sovereign nations. Not quite the same as having a single global carbon price, but it would have allowed revealing a carbon price in sort of transactions between parties to the Kyoto Protocol. However, the uptake of that provision, Article 17 of the Kyoto Protocol, was relatively limited, and some analysis suggests simply because countries, you know, are driven by politics, not by a profit maximizing incentive to reduce their costs of achieving domestic targets or their Kyoto Annex B targets. So that never really took off very much. And the other mechanisms, the project-based ones, joint implementation, CDM, et cetera, are of course a different animal altogether. What we instead saw, and quickly sort of after Kyoto and US withdrew, and then we had the Copenhagen Accord, which disappointed many, was a shift in focus. Okay, so we won't have a top-down, global carbon price or global trading system. Instead, what we might see is a bottom-up proliferation of different carbon pricing regimes, and we will see linking. And indeed, the European Commission, I find that still remarkable, in 2009 and 2010 came out with formal communications, so sort of policy statements in which it sketches out this expectation that we would have integrated carbon pricing regimes, first, in Europe and in the OECD by 2015 with Canada, the US, Australia, and by 2020, we'd start adding some of the other emerging economies like China, Brazil, India, etc. I mean, that has so not happened, but it was still something that people really expected, that there would be movement in that direction. Instead, what we've seen is, of course, these kinds of linkages be hampered by a number of considerations. Andre mentioned it took more than 10 years to get the Swiss EU link really operational. Things like migration policy, the location of airports. There's so much baggage that tends to weigh down these negotiations on linkage. The other ones, of course, are that each system, each ETS, each carbon trading system emerges in a context reflecting the politics, the stakeholder priorities, the lobbying and regulatory capture, etc., in its respective context. So they are different, and integrating them, linking them, meets a number of obstacles when you have such system differences. Andre was heavily involved in a World Bank effort to develop a mechanism to kind of overcome these differences by saying, instead of requiring harmonization and comparability, we'll instead sort of create a mechanism to allow, comparing rather than having them be fully compatible, allow to compare them through a ratings-based system in which you back out a mitigation value and you have discount systems, et cetera, to deal with these differences. And you would simply agree that there are some systems that are less environmentally, have less integrity than others, so they may have to suffer a discount on the mitigation value in any kinds of transactions. As you can imagine, politically, that again was not particularly popular with those jurisdictions that would stand to probably be considered to be not so robust in such an independent ratings process. So again, that didn't go very far. So altogether, what are we left with is, carbon pricing is slowly but gradually moving forward. It is proliferating around the globe, but relatively heterogeneous. Any ideas of having integration, linkage, or the latest proposal by the IMF of having sort of a carbon price for a minimum price level staggered by GDP per capita, et cetera, across jurisdictions, face a lot of political headwind. It's really, really hard to make progress on that. And that's probably not going to change. And unfortunately, time is not on our side. We need solutions soon and urgently. So we cannot wait 10, 20, or 30 years as we've kind of waited for cooperation around carbon pricing to have solutions here. Let's go to the next slide. So on BCAs, at least so far, we don't have too much kind of real empirical, observations or data on cooperation, but what we have does not necessarily suggest that the trajectory would be dramatically and wildly more successful than it has been with carbon pricing. If you remember, in 2021, there were some media stories that Boris Johnson allegedly wanted to include, border tariffs or border carbon adjustments on the agenda of its G7 presidency. And then that disappeared. And we can kind of imagine probably why, because some G7 members simply were not ready to talk about that yet. In 2021, Finance Minister Scholz in Germany, his ministry issued a report, sort of a proposal based on input from an advisory council of economists to the ministry. And of course, this year, not only is he chancellor, but Germany also has the G7 presidency. Yet still, despite saying early in the year at the World Economic Forum that this is his signature thing that he wants to bring into sort of the climate discussion, the G7 statement on climate clubs that we got out of Schloss Elmau in June this year, out of the G7 summit, is really relatively soft, I would say, and it doesn't even mention border carbon adjustments. It doesn't exclude them, but it certainly also doesn't mention them. There's this other mystery in the room, which is, of course, the EU-US joint statement on steel and aluminum. And we don't really know what's happening there. Even people who are closer to national governments or the EU cannot say exactly in which direction this may head or not. It does mention things like having a working group to talk about common standards. And it does mention this goal of having something by the end of next year that would sort of deal with both non-market excess capacity of steel and aluminum, but also with carbon intensity of steel and aluminum and trade. And it's supposedly going to go with. We have really very little guidance on where this is headed, if at all, and what might come out next year. So again, I think it's too early to say clearly there's a vision of cooperation on BCAs, and we will see a lot of we'll see a surge of sort of club-like cooperation with joint BCAs and conditions and exclusion, etc. So all that to say that we think it may be a little bit premature to place too many hopes on clubs with BCAs, some kind of joint BCA as the common sanction, as the common exclusion mechanism, if you like, and should maybe focus on some of the other elements that Aaron mentioned earlier, but this is already part of the conclusions. So I'll hand it back to Andre, who will sum up.
Well, you almost did it. Look, I will make it simpler. We have this presentation here, but on markets, we started with one market, and we had this great idea that it was going to be one global market, one price. Fantastic story. It never worked out. I mean, never got that far because nobody was going to give away the freedom of its energy matrix to somebody else. It's just not going to happen. And then we looked at linked carbon market, as he said, but that was very difficult because it's a long story and conditions change. And we look at network carbon market. We try to adjust for different levels of effort. If you look at CBAM, which is kind of the plan B. I mean, plan A was do nothing. Plan B was to do carbon pricing, and plan C is to do CBAM because we have no other plan. It is becoming increasingly clear that the Europe at 100 euros a ton, it's just, unless somebody is sitting on enormous margins and somebody is sitting on enormous, 100 euros a ton is going to make a difference. It's just illogical otherwise. And we know because we've looked at industries where 15 euros a ton was making a 10% on the bottom line. So this is real. So CBAM was the next thing, and we started with the national CBAM. The EU had this great idea, the CBAM. They didn't like it initially. They brought it in, and we are working through it. But the more we look, I mean, the more we all looking through it, including Michael, Aaron, Olivier, Brigitte, whoever it is, we're looking more through it. It's interesting, but there's a lot, the devil's in the details. And it's getting increasingly complex because you got exports. What do you do with exports? You're gonna ignore the guy who's the exports? What are you gonna do? You're not gonna have like the German chemical industry is gonna disappear. What's gonna happen? So this is some real stuff, at least in our mind. So CBAM all of a sudden became complicated. You know, you started the Canadians, the UK, the Americans, everybody having their own little CBAM. This is was a prescription for chaos, which nobody wanted. So then we went to the next stage and we started talking about clubs. And the club story was that we would have kind of inside the lager, we would have a carbon pricing or level of effort, similar level of effort, and you would have around it, you'd have you'd have a CBAM that would keep the bad guys out and protect the people that want to be ambitious. But that is premised on the fact that a club can be formed and that there's the agreement on the level of effort, maybe expressed in prices, maybe expressed in something else, is something that can be reached. And I think that, I mean, my colleagues have already postulated this to some degree. I think this is also proving to be very elusive. It's not, you know, you get the United States, China, the EU, India in the same room. I mean, I'm not sure how you're going to do this. It's 100 euros per ton in India. It's just not the same thing as here. It's just never going to be. So it's complicated. So the way we see it, and I think Michael has already alluded, is this concept, which also is very elegant intellectually. The same way carbon pricing, but for the same reasons, it looks difficult to achieve. And the fact of the matter is that we're, as Justin Trudeau would say, we're 2022. And by the time it's 2027, it's not very far. I'm still, I still have a time horizon of 2027, I think. I'm not sure, but maybe yes. But certainly many of you will have that time horizon. Many of the investment have that time horizon. So we're not talking about, sometime in another world. So something is going to happen. And it's not going to happen fast enough. So the reality is beginning to hit is that we're going to have to be probably, I would want to say called more realistic, for lack of different word, and start looking at cooperation around the various measures that are being put in different ways at the national level, because this is the reality that we're seeing in carbon pricing. This is what the different measures to deal with a difference in asymmetry in levels of effort. We're going to have to look at standards. We're going to have to look at disclosure. We're going to have to look at a lot of things where we can cooperate and make at least life simpler and try to avoid friction that would emerge from having a very fragmented world with very, very different world and everybody different. So it is not necessarily a negative view in terms of the role of CBAMs in a carbon club context, if you want. It is simply the reality that the reason why we look for a CBAM as a solution is going to create the same problem that we didn't find a solution through carbon pricing. And as a result of that, I think we need to be realistic, but we do need to find a solution because time is pressing us. If the science is right and we do need to do this stuff, then, you know, especially in Europe, this is going to become increasingly dramatic. I mean, this is becoming increasingly dramatic this winter, and it's going to become increasingly dramatic next winter. But this is the same thing is going to become increasingly dramatic in terms of industrial Europe. And it's easy to sign it's easy to lose a customer. It's a very difficult process to get a new customer. I think Olivier and you probably know this better than me, but I've sold enough memberships in my life to know that. So I will stop here. Pauline has been also thrown into this as a newcomer in ERCST, and it's been a real trooper. She's chosen to observe for this time, but I'm sure that next time she's going to take the lead on all this. And I want to thank her for her contribution as Bente and Elena. So we stop here. If you want to stop sharing the screen. And what we will do now, I think there's a couple of people. There's one person, Giorgio, I saw your hand up, unless it's a mistake. But we'll try and go to the first of all to the presenters. So Tim, you go first.
Sure. So thank you for this excellent report and the presentation. I think there's a lot of important work contained in this report, and I think you know, for all of us who are worried about the climate situation and are attuned to the trade-related aspects of it, the EU has just done the world a service by pushing forward, you know, a concrete proposal for a CBAM that has spurred so much of both the activity of this kind of thinking as well as the activity at the governmental and intergovernmental level. So I've got sort of a set of comments here that are really sort of three kinds of comments that I want to make. Maybe the place to start is where Andre sort of left off, which is the issue of time. That we don't really have as much time as we might like. And so if you think about the evolution of the GATT to the WTO, or you think about the sort of evolution of the EU into what it is today, we probably don't have that kind of time to sort of play out the BCA scenario. And so I think the report is quite right to suggest, and is consistent with other work that has sort of suggested, look, we need to be very practical in terms of what we can move forward on the timeline that we need to move things forward. We need to move policy forward. So I think in a number of respects, and Aaron's very good presentation on sort of general principles, I think really highlights, you know, something that should hopefully be, I think, relatively achievable within the time frame that both allows nations to achieve some degree of cooperation on BCAs without sacrificing the immediacy of the problem. I have some concerns, though, about the shape of cooperation going forward on BCAs, you know, some of this will be familiar to some of the authors and co-panelists. The first issue, and I think this comes up in multiple, and actually I should say one other thing about the report before I move on, which is that I found it very helpful that the report, although in your presentation you talked about dealing with this potentially at the WTO or at the UNFCCC, I actually found it quite helpful that the report is not framed in terms of legal issues that arise under either of those systems. I think that's consistent with the emphasis on practicality and on so a kind of solution-driven response. And part of the reason for that is that, and this sort of leads into my first comment, is that I think in reality, a lot of these issues are not likely to come up in these multilateral institutions, these near universal institutions. They're really likely to be done bilaterally or in small groups. And so this brings me to my first issue, which is just the word price is used a lot in the report. The word price was featured heavily in the presentation. There's a lot of good reasons for that. The issue is that as the report notes, it's very unlikely that the United States is going to adopt a carbon price of any kind. There may be subnational carbon pricing in the United States. But you're not likely to get this at the federal level. What you're much more likely to see is domestic decarbonization measures that are pursued through regulatory approaches. And so, a threshold question is, how does international cooperation on BCAs deal with that kind of heterogeneity? And one response is to say, look, it's actually really complicated to try to marry up a pricing system of any kind. We already have such enormous diversity, as the report talks about, in pricing systems. It's to try to marry that up to regulatory measures is a whole another degree of complexity that is just a bridge too far, or at least a bridge too far now. And I don't want to minimize the technical complications with that. I don't want to minimize the diplomatic issues that arise with that. But I do want to sort of put out there for thought that, if the United States is going to be at the federal level a major participant in cooperation on BCAs, it's very likely that there's going to have to be some sort of engagement with the issue of regulatory approaches that are not price-based. And so, I'd be interested in sort of the author's thoughts. It seems to me that this could be done at any of the levels that you all identify in the report. It would be possible to deal with the regulatory issue. But it does seem like, if we're going to move at pace with one of the world's largest economies involved, it's going to have to take on the regulatory issue as distinct from pricing mechanisms. The second thing I just wanted to highlight is the trade facilitation problem. And so you all mentioned this, particularly in the section on harmonizing standards and methodologies. Obviously, you're attuned to this issue. But I wonder whether or not this is not a bigger problem that requires more attention. And the reason is that industry, and you mentioned this in your presentation, but industry is very likely to, particularly multinational enterprises, are going to be just very concerned about the possibility that they're going to have to essentially stand up entire departments that are going to be involved in managing essentially the import-export side of multiple different BCAs. And the concern there is that this is essentially a built-in lobby against BCAs in countries if you can't solve the what you all have framed as the harmonization problem, what I would maybe describe as a trade facilitation problem. It seems to me that getting cooperation on those issues is just going to be absolutely critical to the political sustainability of any sort of BCA model. The multiplication of import requirements could be a real detriment to trade, but really the problem there is, I think, that it ends up being a detriment to BCAs by engendering backlash. And that brings me to my final comment here, which is just the issue of cooperation at the border, harmonizing BCAs in some way, carbon clubs, as Michael mentioned, in kind of the real sense of a carbon club, or in the technical sense of a club where there's really an excludable good. So again, I think you all are right. The report is absolutely correct to note the imperative related to timing. As the report notes, though, and I think Aaron, you said this, you know, to some extent, what a BCA, what sort of harmonizing BCAs would look like would be, you know, it would look sort of like a customs union. We know that cooperation on customs union is possible. And the question is whether or not it's possible on the scale here, on the time frame that we need, given that the scale is actually pretty relatively small, right? We're not necessarily talking about economy-wide cooperation. We're talking about cooperation on energy-intensive, trade-exposed sectors. And in some ways, the EU-US global arrangement on steel and aluminum is a nice starting point because it's sectoral specific. You're basically taking one sector and say, look, let's use this very trade-controlled area as kind of a demonstration project for seeing how we could build this out in terms of cooperation. And so, you know, one question I think I have here is just whether you're too pessimistic about the possibility of building out a customs union-like solution here that would presumably start on a sectoral basis and then could potentially be expanded. One of the benefits that I'm not sure that you sort of talked about in connection with the club here, or you mentioned it, but maybe don't make a big enough deal about, is that this solves the trade facilitation problem as between members of the club. So it's not just sort of a carrot and sticks issue. In a customs union, that's the whole point of a customs union, is that internal barriers to trade basically vanish. And so, you know, the carbon club and particularly the sort of global arrangement type idea where there's, as I think you described as kind of a punitive outward looking measure, as well as sort of harmonization at the border on the inside. The real benefit here, I think, is in fact this trade facilitation problem that makes it easier to cooperate internally. Now, I don't want to minimize the issue, as the report quite rightly notes. Harmonization at the domestic level on different decarbonization strategies is not likely, and therefore harmonizing at the border without harmonizing behind the border raises a whole host of problems that would require countries, I think, to be sort of thoughtful, to be willing to compromise, to be flexible on the application of things like WTO rules. So I don't want to minimize those issues, but I do think that you know, the benefits to the climate and the benefits to the diplomatic process of thinking about building out a carbon club type strategy that starts with kind of a proof of concept in one or two sectors and then builds out from there, has potentially significant benefits in solving the harmonization problem that I think you all rightly identified. So I don't want to take up too much time, so I'll stop there because I know we've got a few more commenters.
No, thanks, Tim. I think we'll come back. I think you made some interesting points, and I hope that people don't engage. Eileen, I saw you nodding a few times.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. And thanks for this timely report. I really enjoyed reading it. It's an important report in that regard that we do have limited political capital for international collaboration. At this point, we have a lot of things that need to be achieved through international collaboration. So it really is kind of it's really important that we sort of focus this political capital and attention on the right kinds of things that are actually feasible. So in that regard, we agree, and we've put out, Agora has put out a report on this as well, that sort of focusing within the club's framework or international collaboration on trying to create convergence on carbon pricing regimes. That's actually not a very doable exercise, on the technical level. We've talked about the complexities about linking up carbon pricing systems, but then also on a political level. And we've seen this now play out in reality, as has been described before, with the German proposal for a climate club that started out really ambitious with the initial announcement last fall, where it spoke of having an international carbon price floor and potentially border carbon adjustment, communicating that message through the through the, what was it, World Economic Forum in Davos, where Scholz still talked about international carbon price floor, and then all of a sudden that being dropped in the negotiations with the rest of the G7 members, so that it wasn't actually being any language on common carbon pricing was nowhere to be found in the final communique at the summit. So I think we saw that play out in reality there, how difficult it is to find any sort of agreement, and I really appreciated sort of like the historical sort of embedding of where we've tried this before and where it has failed, in the hope that that will inform decision makers to sort of not go down that road again. One thing that I was also missing, similar to Tim before, was sort of like a comment on non-pricing policies and crediting for them. We've touched on them in the bit about sort of agreeing on rules of fair play and best practice, that there should be some crediting for equivalence. We have seen this mentioned explicitly in the German G7 final proposal, that there is a role by the OECD's IFCMA. Don't ask me what that stands for, but sort of looking at the Aaron puts on his thinking face. Maybe you'll say it a bit, but to look at sort of finding equivalence of pricing and non-pricing policies, or kind of like a translation mechanism or comparability mechanism. So I was just wondering, I mean, the Agora approach is similar to sort of the linking up carbon pricing systems approach, is that it's just simply, it's too complex. It's trying to, and what kind of policies would you include in that? So a matter of trying to compare apples and oranges. But it would be really interesting to hear further comments on how the role of the IFCMA in this whole collaboration on BCAs, what that could be, what you view that like. What I do want to say though is that, you know, we've talked about the terminologies or the three different types of clubs that we can envision. And I think we actually see very strong development on the first two types of clubs. So we said normative and bargaining clubs as names for the categories, right? So we have seen last year at the COP, we've seen a lot of announcement of initiatives that really make a lot of progress in directions that are very helpful also towards supporting any border carbon adjustment scheme. So if we look at the standards for exactly embedded carbon emission measurement that are being developed, there's a lot of progress there. We now saw it in Pittsburgh, that we have a lot of, the US joined the IDDI, and the IDDI worked on developing exactly those standards, and the IEA put out those standards for steel and cement. So we see a lot of development that can then sort of feed into future border carbon adjustment designs and help sort of harmonize at least the measurement of the embedded carbon of the traded goods. So that is a sort of very welcome development in that regard. We also think that I guess it's sort of, if you think about it, it's kind of like a club of clubs. We have several different sort of clubs with several different memberships. If we look at the breakthrough agenda, for example, they have, I don't know, 42 countries, and then the IDDI is 5 now, and it's kind of it's a scattered sort of mosaic of little clubs that focus on a subset of industrial decarbonization. And they all, in their way, and I think the governance will be, the question of governance is kind of the elephant in the room. How do you sort of orchestrate them and take them forward? But if you look at them holistically and take a step back, they already sort of provide a good complement and support system to the application of border carbon adjustments. Because if you think about BCAs, then the whole reason of the existence of BCAs is the asymmetry that you have in climate ambition, in industrial decarbonization of these sectors. And now that this sort of international framework is working towards accelerating and globally accelerating, taking a lot of countries and helping them accelerate their industrial decarbonization, then that will lead to a shrinking, hopefully, a shrinking of that differential. Another elephant in the room there that kind of was somewhat touched on in your paper was that the border carbon adjustment, of course, has differential impacts on different kinds of countries. And so it differentially impacts developing countries in that the measures to sort of comply with this and decarbonize and not have to pay a huge carbon border adjustment would be to put immense amounts of money into industry decarbonization, which for certain countries simply isn't possible. So if we look at the landscape of international collaboration at this stage, this is still very much a black box. There's not enough international climate finance. Also, really, if you look at the subset of money going into to industry, that is even less. So we need to grow the pie and grow the share that's going to industry to help developing countries participate in these green markets of the future. That is really not being addressed at all. It's been part of the German proposal as part of the Climate Club to look at this, but really sort of coming up with concrete solutions to sort of leapfrog developing countries into clean production technologies, that's still missing in the picture. Final comments. What we'll see, or ideally what we'll see as these initiatives sort of take effect, is that we will converge more and more towards sort of cleaner average sectoral emissions intensity per country. What we say, and what we've sort of been trying to push instead of focusing on convergence or carbon pricing, is that we will, in any sort of like climate club setup, could converge on common CO2 product requirements. Now, one question that I don't have an answer to this, but I'm just going to throw it in the room, is that any common CO2 product requirement that is sort of agreed upon by a number of people in a group, in a club, would kind of be a form of border carbon adjustment, no? It could be seen as a way of creating a barrier to trade that costs money to adhere to. And if we propose this now for a subset of countries to say, well, you could sort of converge to CO2 product requirements in the medium term, that again sort of creates an interesting interaction with the question of any sort of price-based border carbon adjustment, and would have to potentially exist in parallel, but it's complex. So that's something that I haven't solved for myself, but I want to throw it in the room. Yeah, that's it for me.
Thanks, Eileen. Makane, as I received an email from his assistant that there is a treaty that needs to be investment treaty for Africa that needs to conclude today, and he's advising a number of African countries. So that is the explanation. And I guess he has to give priority to that one. Lucas.
Yes, thanks. Also, thank you very much for having me. First of all, congratulations to this report. I think it's really insightful. Also, the historic description of the failure to coordinate carbon pricing was really, I kind of knew, but it's nice to see it written down so clearly and take the lessons from it. I also agree with a discussion about how freely we should use the club label. I sometimes get the impression that the researchers are kind of upset if policymakers don't adhere to the academic definitions, but it's not how the world works. It works the other way around. So, and that's why I'm also very open to consider other goods, not necessarily exclusive goods, to found a club. And I think there are a few. Actually, your point of harmonization, in my view, it's a club good, right? If you can offer a mechanism to harmonize systems, that's a club benefit. It could be part of a club proposal. It's not exclusive, probably, but I think it is a big incentive for countries to be on the table, especially smaller ones that otherwise wouldn't be able to influence the global standard setting process, right? You would leave it to chance, basically, to see what industry follows or doesn't follow. But if you coordinate on that, you might be able to shape the standards and define them collectively. Also, we've been working on technology cooperation, which I think is a really important and potentially huge club benefit. We've looked a lot into steel, and just to give you a sense of the scale of the technological and engineering challenge ahead of us. So currently we have 1.4 billion tons of steel production annually from blast furnaces that will have to be converted to either CCS or hydrogen-based steelmaking eventually. And we've just talked to someone from a major equipment manufacturer for the steel industry, and they say that currently with the hydrogen-based steel making, we have kind of annual production capacity from the engineering side of 5 million tons per year. So in the early 30s, we will have to build 1 green steel plant per week, and currently we can build 2 per year. So that is just, yeah, so there is a huge mismatch. The most promising technologies are in the hands of just 2 companies, one in the US and one in Italy. We need to somehow license these technologies. We need to broaden the engineering base. There is a need to organize license funds. International funds could help that, maybe look at the Montreal Protocol who did similar things. So I think there is a huge scope for a real benefit if you look just beyond carbon pricing. Also, coordination of infrastructure investments in renewable energy, hydrogen, carbon capture, or carbon infrastructure will be hugely important for industry to build up. And there is a benefit in coordinating that. It's probably not necessarily exclusive, but still could be basis for a club. And I'm always skeptical about these Nordhaus-style club arguments. Kind of the basic argument is that the freedom from trade restriction is the club good. But the trade restrictions wouldn't be there in the absence in the club. So in the sense, it is an incentive to join an existing club, but it's not an incentive to found a club. If you think that through a little bit more, actually the existence of one or more unilateral border carbon adjustment mechanisms could be even a precondition for building a Nordhaus-style club, because otherwise there is no incentive to consolidate that and join that and get that freedom from that. So I think there is room for border carbon adjustments in a climate club, but it's probably at the end, the last stage of completing the club portfolio, and the club could start with a lot of other useful club goods earlier. And for me personally, I think even, or maybe as important as the club goods are other club features. I think a climate club should improve on the existing governance landscape that we have. We have the Paris Agreement, which is excellent, but it has flaws. For example, goal attainment is not binding. Can a club, at least in some small area, get to really binding targets and bind the members of the club? Also, the UNFCCC, as you all know, is limited in its decision-making capacity by the consensus rule. Could we come up with an arrangement that can be more ambitious and have some form of qualified majority decision-making? It would also have to have a proper compliance mechanism, which is not just facilitative. I think that's another shortcoming of the Paris Agreement, where a club could be a real benefit. And in that, I think a climate club could be well complementary to the UNFCCC, with a focus on implementation. And I would echo very much Tim's remarks that the sectoral focus is probably the best starting point. As I said, we've worked on steel and have put out a kind of sketch of a international steel trade club in Nature Climate Change. I can share that link, where I think it really becomes clear what club benefits can be beyond these carbon pricing aspects. And I still think that if you build the trust, if you build the club, then the last stage could be some border carbon adjustment mechanism coordination or joint application is in your third stage proposal. Yeah. Maybe one last point, I think, which is also related to the UNFCCC and the principles of it. We always say that the club should be inclusive. That's kind of an oxymoron, right? So a club is by definition exclusive. But I think that could be overcome by a really clear pathway to membership that is based off predetermined criteria. So it's not if the club rules are specified so that the entering of a new country or a new subnational entity or a new company could also be a transnational club, in my view. It's not dependent on the interest or the goodwill of the club members, but on clear criteria. And if you meet that criteria, you will be a member. That is, I think, a pathway to making a club as inclusive as it can be, probably. Yeah, but in general, I think it's a really good contribution. I think that these three stages help. What I'm missing, not only in your paper, but in the general idea, is to broaden and look more closely for club goods beyond this carbon pricing idea, because there are quite many potential benefits that no one talks about.
Well, I guess another piece of the puzzle, and we can discuss many aspects. Some of the things that you mentioned, customs union, non-pricing that were mentioned here, non-pricing harmonization, club compatibility to UNFCCC. You may be surprised to hear that we had a strong discussion among ourselves whether a club is a complementary or it is actually trying to replace the Paris Agreement. We had that discussion. We agreed to disagree, as you can may well imagine. Brigitta.
Yeah, I have 2 points. One short one and one.
Say who you are, because I'm not sure that. Introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry. Brigitta Huckestein from BASF Energy and Climate Policy. Yeah, I have 2 points. One is on the CBAM and the reaction of third countries. You mentioned that there is not very clear answers yet, unless we really have a clearer legislation at the table. And I heard some very precise arguments for that from third countries, which was, we are sitting on the table and calculating what's in for us. Of course, it depends on things like export rebates and so on, how it will influence other countries. And if it's fine for us, we won't complain. But if it's not fine for us, we will go to WTO, which in fact means, as a signal to Europe, we can't win, because either we sort of balance it in a way that industry in Europe is not protected fully anymore, then nobody will complain. Otherwise, if we do protect industry, it's clear that they will complain. That's what I hear from others, and it matches perfectly what has been said before. Now on climate clubs, let me also go back quite a bit. I don't know the exact years. It has been 5 or even more years ago on the G20 level. We were very active, also asking for further climate measures at G20, and there was the requests, which has been also for the following years in the G20 papers, on setting up a carbon pricing platform. In fact, this carbon pricing platform is something which now went into the request for carbon clubs. But what's the difference now? Why is it not anymore what just sort of sitting together and looking together how we can move forward together in the best way? The need for climate clubs is actually that Europe has taken the decision that the European inhabitants shall pay for global decarbonization in some way. Because we are raising our prices here in Europe because we include the CO2 prices. And so we are creating a green market with higher prices. And now it depends on the setup of each country, how they can react to that. In the US, we see with a little bit of funding, they allow for CO2-free products, but still the CO2-free products can be sold in Europe at higher prices than in the US, because the competitive production processes here in Europe are more expensive than in the US. And so in fact, why is Europe asking for climate clubs? Because we don't want to pay for the transition and for the development of new technologies alone. If we have a carbon club and other jurisdictions also increase their price level, paying for the higher prices for these green products, it would be rather a club which is willing to pay higher costs for CO2-free production. And I think that's the need. Of course, it is the same thing as having a carbon price. It's sort of just putting the things vice versa in communication, but it is really, who is paying, and we want more people to pay for it than just the Europeans. And I think the request from developing countries to be at the table, they should be at the table for sure, for really taking their view in and for doing the regulation. But if a carbon club really is framed as those countries who are willing to pay, nobody of those countries would want to be at the table, because they say for right that the industrial countries or more wealthy countries are those who need to pay the bill for the transition, for the development. But I think that is really a different view, even though content-wise it's still the same, but that might make a change how to frame climate clubs. It still shows it will be elusive having this for the whole world, but it may help to really get a better connection to less developed countries, not seeing pushed out, but seeing this as an effort of more wealthy countries to take the burden of develop these new technologies, and when they are cheaper, they can be rolled out to the rest of the world. So that's just as an input or some food for thought, thinking about the climate club issue.
Interesting. I mean, the Brigida sees the club. I mean, I'm putting words in your mouth now, but the club as those that wish to pay.
Yeah.
First, that's the way you see it. Interesting. Aaron and Michael, you know, I'm sharing this. I'm trying to restrain myself from reacting. This is the disadvantage of being in this position. But you guys are not restrained by anything except the willingness to speak. So who wants to speak?
In my case, unwillingness to speak is not much of a restraint, because I'm always willing to speak.
Go ahead.
Just some thoughts, and as a chapeau to these thoughts, to say that, you know, normally when you go to these kinds of events, you have the formal presentations and then the discussion, and the formal presentation is the meat and the discussion is sort of fringe. In this case, the comments from the discussions have actually put the presenters to shame. It's been a rich set of comments that I think have added real value to the message we bring in the report, and I want to thank all of you. But just some thoughts on what's gone and selective. First to Tim's point on trade facilitation and his plea that we think about this as not only a sort of nice thing to have that, you know, is a low-hanging fruit, but really as a deal breaker. The point is that we're going to be needing the kinds of, if we think just about accounting standards for carbon embedded in goods, it's not just something that we'll need to have for all of those countries that will have BCAs, and I think that will be a small group of countries. We are also looking at efforts for green government procurement, like the General Services Administration was instructed and funded to do under the Inflation Reduction Act in the States, clean steel and cement. We're looking at it in terms of standards, the performance standards, the type that Eileen talked about, that might be the result of the global aluminum and steel arrangement. We're looking at industry commitments, like the First Movers Coalition, the Steel Zero Initiative, Mission Innovation. All of these sorts of initiatives are going to demand that we somehow account for carbon in traded goods. And if there's a plethora of different ways of accounting for it, it is not just an inconvenience. It is, as Tim has said, an existential threat to the very idea of the kind of cooperation we're looking for here. So thank you for bringing that up to a higher level of concern. On the question of non-price policies, this is such a good one. We could have an entire event on this, and in fact, ERCST has committed to further work, extensive work on exactly this subject. But just to say that, you know, the sort of trite answer to the challenges laid out by both Tim and Eileen on this question are, it's not a problem if you really have non-price-based regulatory regimes that lower the carbon intensity of the products you're producing. Fine, you will pay less under CBAM. In fact, you may have a competitive advantage against EU industry in the EU market and in third markets. No problem. Just go ahead and do non-price-based stuff, and if it works, you're fine. That's a sort of a trite-based. There is some truth to that, however, in that, you know, we're not talking about BCA as the climate policy and the climate policy on the basis of which we want to cooperate. Those policies are the fundamental underlying policies of carbon pricing or of regulatory behavior. BCAs is just an adjustment mechanism that tries to make sure our pricing policies don't result in the kinds of problems that Brigitte had talked about, right? But you know, that does ignore the very real political problems involved in trying to accommodate or not accommodate non-price-based regulatory policies. And so that may not be a completely satisfactory answer, but it's one we need to think about. I like Lucas's admonition that we think about not just the kinds of club goods that come from pricing, but a greater array of club goods. And of course, this is, you know, I want to emphasize that in our conclusions, when we say that we don't really see a role for BCA in the short term in these kinds of integrated climate clubs, we are not dismissing the idea of productive climate clubs that may achieve other kinds of club goods. In fact, I think that would be a poor interpretation. I think there's a lot, for example, in the German proposal on climate clubs that has nothing to do with pricing and border carbon adjustment, on technology cooperation, standards, you know, and assistance for decarbonization in developing countries, all of which are excellent proposals, and you know, on the basis of which we should move forward. And just a final thought, very brief, on Brigitte's statement of the European conundrum. You know, a no-win proposition. If border carbon adjustment is effective for EU producers and therefore gets taken to the WTO by our trading partner, EU's trading partners, that is not the end of the story. That does not mean we dismantle the CBAM. In fact, it means that we will fight about it for many years in the WTO, you know, over a decade, in terms of, if we look back at the experience of Airbus-Boeing dispute. And then when we come to a final solution, the EU can always say, yes, we lost. We're not going to change the policy. We're just going to pay you compensation, which they have done in the case of disputes like beef hormones, right? So just to say that WTO illegality is not the final arbiter of what needs to happen. And in that sense, I agree with Tim's thrust on the pragmatic. And for that reason, we haven't talked much about WTO law here. Anyway, I've said too much.
Michael, anything from your side?
Yeah.
What about Brigitte's view that this is a club of people that want to pay or should pay?
You want me to react to that?
Well,
that's something I was absolutely unprepared to react to that, because I'm not sure I understood it entirely. Let me
do what you want.
Yeah, no. Let me save it up to the end. I think it was a good point. I actually picked something else up at the very end of Brigitte's remarks that I will react to. But I wanted to make 2 points before you threw the curveball. The first one was, you know, this was a report about BCAs. Obviously, as Aaron just underscored, I mean, Lucas, you know, your point was we really have to look beyond just the sort of carbon pricing and BCAs and that narrow context and the narrow definition of club goods here, and look at many of these other things that will probably be much more important going forward. And I fully agree. We artificially, if you like, narrowed our perspective on web cooperation specifically on BCAs. But you're right, though, that this could be part of something broader that includes many other elements, and many of those being carrots. And I'll step back, you know, I know that many of, well, I doubt that any colleagues at MIT are listening, so I'm probably safe. I actually don't believe that we will solve the climate problem focusing on the sticks. I really don't. I don't know, maybe I'm getting old and pessimistic, but if I look at what has worked in the last 20 years, it's the carrots. Now, you have to, of course, take a step back and remember that all of these spillovers that we're navigating and trying to work on have trade-offs, have two sides. On the emissions leakage side, the spillover is negative for the climate, but it's been very positive for us as consumers because we have outsourced production to lower production cost countries and have benefited from lower cost products. The producers hate that. The consumers go straight to the low-cost discount stores, you know, and buy one of the outputs or one of the results of that. On the positive side, the spillovers of clean technology innovation, the diffusion of these clean technologies, if you look at the story of, you know, Europe and some other advanced economies investing billions and billions every year. I think Germany, it was on average 20 billion to scale up and drive down the cost of renewable energy. That around the world now and in perpetuity is one of the biggest contributions to solve the climate problem. The producers of solar panels in Germany hated this. The climate, though, is benefiting from it. So I think it's really important always to see that there's two sides to this. And I think the positive spillovers, as much as industrial policy, this is not necessarily a good industrial policy solution, but the positive technology or innovation spillovers are going to be key to solving climate. And indeed, we can do a lot more to lower barriers, capacity barriers, lower finance, access to finance, high capital costs, risk, all those things on the positive spillover side. So absolutely, that is probably going to be more important for the climate than our desperate attempts to keep sort of the whack-a-mole game. We're constraining emissions with carbon pricing, they pop up somewhere else. We're trying to apply BCAs, but then there'll be resource shuffling, there will be circumvention, there'll be all kinds of ways to avoid it. And in the end, we're really just trying to chase sort of the negative, the unintended consequences of trying to constrain emissions, whereas at the same time, the market is driving these technologies that we need to overcome the problems on its own, essentially, irrespective of politics, irrespective of elections. But that wasn't the topic of our paper, and that's why we didn't go deep into that. On the second point, the one that I wanted to react to was indeed the non-pricing policies. You know, I live in the US, and I'm 100% with Tim that we're just not going to see it happen at the federal level in our, at least in the years that we still consider, you know, our productive years.
In your lifetime, but I think that's too much.
No, I'm not going to go that far, but at least sort of our productive career. And you know, we've had hopes too often and saw them disappointed too often, even when circumstances were a lot better, like in 2009, 2010, totally different majorities on the Hill, et cetera. And still it didn't happen, and it didn't happen again, and it won't happen, I think, anytime in the future. So we do have to deal with that. And I fully agree that, you know, André was hinting that we have disputes among ourselves. I mean, Aaron lives in Canada. Canada has gone fully the carbon pricing route. So he's throwing all the arguments out why it's methodologically very difficult. Another thing that I think wasn't mentioned, which is also something to contend with, is once you open the door to any kind of policy that imposes a cost or at least sort of helps achieve climate targets, and whether it's a private or a public cost, one can probably find methodologies to quantify that. Once you do that, the EU is going to ask for the same thing. EU producers will say, wait a minute, this was just adjusting the EU ETS. But if we're adjusting for performance standards and for who knows what other things in the US, then we have to open up our scope as well, because we're paying, you know, fuel excise taxes. We are paying all kinds of other charges, and not just price-based, but also non-price things to decarbonize outside of the pure EU ETS scope. That is something I think we haven't really fully thought through yet, what the implications would be of broadening that. And I don't think I revealed too much in saying that, you know, some of that will definitely feature in our last report, the fourth out of this project, which is about crediting, you know, foreign policies and how to do that. I think we can't avoid talking about this, but there may also, there has to be other work on this going forward. Okay, now I've talked too much, so back to you.
Look, I mean, we do see efforts. You know, there are governments that currently look at their fuel taxes and they want to transform that into a carbon tax. It's simply relabeling. I mean, they do the same thing, you just relabel it. And, you know, all of a sudden it's a lot of euros per ton in that country. Why not? The other thing that I wanted to also mention is I always thought from the beginning, that sounds kind of silly, but I thought it was power in numbers, that the EU doing this alone, I think it's always going to be fraught with danger. It's difficult. I mean, the situation is not the same as when we did aviation. So it is not the same. At that point, everybody jumped on the EU, and the EU had to back down, to be quite blunt about it. The situation is not the same, but nevertheless, the EU doing this alone is probably difficult. But EU and the US, or EU and China, or, you know, two others, the big three, or some combination, it probably had a much better chance of survival and success, or at least that's what I saw. The other thing is, I remember the BDI, and very serious people did very serious studies, you know, a very big study, and basically said, listen, we can do 95% or 90%. We can do it in Europe, but if you want to go to 95 or higher, we need the G20. It's just not doable. And that's another club, at least in my mind. I mean, what they said, they were screaming, listen, like, we can't do this alone. We need other people to be inside with us. That's the way we won't survive. So is this really, I mean, is this much more complicated in the end that, hey, we don't want to be alone because we don't have the power to impose alone? It is in the end something, if you think about it in very different terms, and some people have used this stuff, it is a way of imposing, very contrary to the Paris Agreement, a top-down price on people. That's what it is. I mean, if you put a BCA and if you want to export to Europe, then you got to pay the same price as Europe, or else you're out of luck. So how is this? I mean, is this resonate? I don't know, Lucas. What do you think? Is it resonate at all with you, or this is something that is too simplistic? It's much more complicated than that.
I don't know. I think maybe one aspect that I would like to add to this is that this discussion, and generally this price-based discussion, I think is a lot still about burden sharing, effort sharing, however you call it. And I think in many areas, we are starting to realize that we also need to look into opportunity sharing and who is going to develop the technologies of the next century, in a sense, and who's going to market that. And I think for industries in Europe, this is also a question, right? They need certainty to invest in the technologies and be able to remain technological leaders, in a sense. At the same time, if we want to resolve this issue globally, those technologies will have to be applied globally. And yeah, I don't know. just that this burden sharing boomerang comes back and back again, and I think this who gets to reap the benefits of transformation and the opportunities, economic opportunities that come about that will be I think the discussion of the future. Michael, you mentioned the solar move from Germany to China, which I think is a first instance, but we'll see a lot more instances of similar questions, whether that's steel technologies, electrolyzers, electric vehicles. I mean, there are so many technology, batteries, where this whole questions is being negotiated, and I think that's probably in response to Brigitte. It's not only about who is willing to pay, but also who's positioning themselves to gain 20 years down the line, 15 years, 10 years.
Yeah, go ahead, Brigitte, and then maybe you want to come back, Eileen.
Just a direct comment on the last point. Of course, it's also the different how countries can position themselves. The US can afford to have big funding projects, which of course puts them into a position to react to such a legislation, while India, for example, probably may have more problems to do the same. In fact, we force every country who is exporting to the EU to balance whether they have the wealth to transfer or to transition this part of their production to a level that is accepted by the EU, or whether they cannot. And those who cannot will be the losers. So these are actually exactly the countries who should receive money under an UN FCCC program to help developing countries to react to climate measures. I think it's a balance between two things. One is really how do we get the transition of technologies at reasonable costs, but the other way, which sort of from my point of view is drifting much out of sight, is how can we get a maximum of climate protection within a certain amount of money? And we are allocating a lot of money into these global technology development, which of course then will result that these technologies will be built up where governments are setting up the best measures. But talking about the COP coming up and about Article 6, maybe we could do much more by using Article 6 when it is in place. It's not yet. I know there are some further steps are needed, but having this in a better balance.
Because I tell you what, I mean, there's two things. First of all, Article 6 is in the end about markets, and it's about protocols, how to transfer, how to buy and sell. That's what Article 6 is. There's the last part of Article 6, which Aaron and Michael, you guys know, and many of you know, is this Article 6.8, which is non-price cooperation or not trading cooperation, but it is kind of it's lost in space somewhere. It's very little used. It is, people are desperately trying to find a use for it, but in the end, they're not finding a use for it, or so far there really hasn't been. But I have a question that I wanna ask, and I mean, we're getting towards the end of our conversation, but I'd like a reaction. I mean, okay, interesting. We wrote a nice paper. I think we're very smart people, and I see hopefully there'll be 1,000 downloads. God bless us. But is this a really relevant conversation, or is this a nice academic thing? And you know, it's a Wednesday afternoon, and we're having a conversation. I'm extremely serious. Is this something that really needs to be addressed? Or not necessarily clubs, but how do we, in the end, where do we go? Because carbon pricing is obviously not doing it. This BCA, national BCA, we're going to have 100 of them. So are we going to have 100 of them? Are we going to try and coordinate them somewhere? Or are we going to, which is part, scope 1 or version 1 or version 2? But how relevant is this conversation, and in what context this is relevant? Because again, writing paper is great, but I really want to know whether this is something that is going to catch fire, not the paper itself, but the issue is going to catch fire, or does it have to catch fire, or is it not going to linger? We're going to have the EU CBAM, and Canadians are going to think about it for a while. I don't know, the Americans are going to have an election in a month and a half, and so on and so forth. So reactions, Aaron, you're smiling, and Tim, like to hear your reaction, guys. It's an honest question.
Maybe I should let Tim go first, as I've already had the floor twice, but I can think of a few ways in which it's...
He spent too much time in the UN. He's going to say, I'm sorry for taking the floor the third time, but go ahead, Tim.
Sure. So I think it's highly relevant for a couple of different reasons. So one that I just alluded to in my comments is that I think in general the EU has done just a fantastic job of thinking through some really hard issues. People may quibble about how they've made the trade-offs, but somebody had to be the first mover here, and so they've launched conversations like these that I think are going to inform both their own efforts, as your earlier reports get at implementation, but also the efforts in other countries. I think, and Andre, I think you sort of alluded to this earlier, though, it's going to be much more effective if you are able to sort of expand cooperation. And so I think thinking through those cooperative issues is just important. I think it's hard to know where the windows for opportunity, when they'll crop up. And so, when the Biden administration took office, the foundation for the global arrangement on steel and aluminum, that was sort of a moment that happened with the change of administration, where there was, to Lucas's earlier point, in steel and aluminum, there already were trade barriers that you were able to essentially lift as kind of as between the US and the EU, as the kind of the foundation for thinking through what cooperation might look like. I don't know in 2019 that you could have foreseen that in 2021 that was going to be available. So I think it's really useful to do a lot of this kind of thinking. I also think that, for all of the good that the EU's proposal has done, I wish they hadn't come out so strongly and defended their proposal in terms of WTO legality. Both because I think their strong versions of their claims are at least debatable, if not incorrect. And I think you guys have just very helpfully taken the same set of issues, particularly in your discussion of principles, and framed them as policy issues that countries and stakeholders need to work through. And I think it's the same set of issues, but I think framing them as policy rather than legal issues is just much more productive. And so I'd really like to applaud you all for for that framing. And again, I just emphasize it's the same set of issues. It's just how you frame it matters how those negotiations shape up. And I think the transatlantic conversation will be better on the terms that you all have set out, as opposed to one that focuses on, the different types of non-discrimination rules that operate at the WTO. And I think, and we've already touched on this, so I won't say much more about it, but I think that the BCAs are basically, there are two kinds of trade barriers. One is the BCA itself, and the other is the complexity and of managing these kinds of systems. And I think that second one just hasn't really received the same kind of attention in the early kind of rounds of thinking about this. And so, I think the conversations about how we deal with that second set of issues, and not just as technical issues, but as a problem that has to be solved in order for these things to be politically viable, is just critically important. And I think you all have launched that conversation effectively.
Thanks, Eileen. I'm sorry, I think I jumped you from the queue. I asked you and then I kind of went haywire. I apologize for that.
Yeah, no worries at all. Yeah, I mean, I have to echo what Tim said. I think it's really important the way that this has been raised. Having these, I mean, you kind of listed the levels of cooperation on BCAs, and starting this conversation on sort of rules of best practice and sort of principles will be very critical in the short term. Also, and this has been raised by another speaker, the question of subsidies, and because what we see now is there's like different ways to go about decarbonization. You can throw a whole bunch of subsidy money at industries and have them decarbonize. And yes, of course, if you then look at kind of the trade aspects and the leakage risk that comes from that, having places where there's just more subsidies and other places where there's carbon pricing, of course there will potentially be relocation of industry. And then it's not carbon leakage, then it's just relocation on the basis of where you have more favorable conditions. So I think that needs to be included in that conversation, that we don't have like a race to the bottom of who can provide the most subsidies. So yeah, definitely very important launch of this report. I think going forward, as kind of like if you look at how things are developing on the climate club front and on how these initiatives are shaping up, I don't think there will be a Nordhaus style club, to be honest. It's kind of, there doesn't seem that the way that these initiatives have been set up right now, and the way that sort of the German proposal has sort of ambitiously started and failed, it doesn't seem to me that the Nordhaus style club will be the way going forward. But this is just sort of my intuition. I think what is kind of more likely to happen, or what could happen, is that we see these bilateral trade agreements that we see in the US GSA, that's still very mysterious, and have them sort of expand from a sort of like small nucleus. But this idea of sort of gathering a group of countries together has kind of, even in the group of 7 has failed. So it'll be interesting to see how sort of bilateral trade agreements will potentially grow in that space. This is my 2 cents.
Thanks, Eileen. Anything else, Lucas, as we start closing?
Yes, no, thanks. I think both the BCA debate and the clubs debate are super complicated. And I think the main merit of this report probably is to structure the ground and lay the foundations for an educated debate, because I think it was really helpful in providing the groundwork of understanding, for me at least, as I have looked more into clubs and less into BCAs. It was really helpful, and on that basis, I think future discussions will be much easier if everyone is on the same level. So that, in that sense, I think it's really good. I have saved one point of criticism or critical question, critical remark, maybe related to the principles that you outlined. I generally liked it, but I stumbled across one and that's the priority of leakage protection, because I think it's as much as it's desirable to have this as a principle, I think it's also naive, because we all know that these competitiveness concerns will always be implicit. And I just don't know what the answer to this is, but I think maybe we need to acknowledge that these questions cannot be separated out or defined out of the political equation. But yeah, but I think that's the only substantive question that I really had, because I think that's impossible to resolve.
Well, in today's language, Lucas, because every era has, there was groovy and there was this, different expression that people use. In today's language is diversity, because Michael and Aaron, myself, when we get into this kind of discussion, we use different language. Like if you listen to me carefully, what I said carbon leakage as a result of competitiveness, and I don't separate the two. I mean, I think it's naive to do so. I acknowledge the fact that the competitive issue is not in any way, shape, or form a monopoly of carbon. But what I said is, in my view, at 100 euros a ton, it's got to be a factor again, unless BASF and others are sitting with enormous margins, which I don't think is the case. So I fully agree with you. But there's one other thing that I wanted to say, and we had an annual general meeting last week, which we passed with colors, but thanks God. But the one thing that we didn't announce that we can say now is, in this space, ERCST is starting a significant project that is going to be a 2.5-year project, which is funded by the government of the United States, looking at the heterogeneity of efforts around the world, making them more comparable, and also for price policies like BCAs and so on. So this is a space that we will continue to be, in the sense that the CBAM discussion in the EU is not over. And I think that it will continue after whatever conclusions we have in the legislative process, because I think that the can is going to be kicked down the road quite a lot. I think people will just avoid making decisions. But there's clearly something that is catching fire, maybe outside the pure CBAM discussion, because there are others who are looking for maybe other solutions, not only a CBAM solution, especially if it's only connected to a visible carbon price. So that is something that we will continue, and we're looking, Tim and others, we will be looking for cooperation in this with you in the future. I'm looking for any other, as they say at the end, any other comments, any other issues. When you finish your AGM, you say any other issues, no other issues. Aaron, you have other issues?
Not other issues. I wanted to respond to your question about, whether we're just a bunch of smart fools that have written a report that can sit on a shelf. So I agree with the other answers that have been given to this question, but in some sense, the answer has been, you've done good basic research, which will have applicability at some future point, and we're not, we have some ideas about where that will happen, but it's not completely clear. But I want to give a conception of the research as sort of applied research in some sense. I mean, we have, if the final message of this report, if one of the final messages of this report is that it's unrealistic to think about a carbon club that uses a BCA as a common external instrument, then that has direct applicability for me in a couple of very current contexts. One is, you've got Japan taking over the presidency of the G7, and there is a commitment to do something on industrial decarbonization and do something with this a pronouncement of a carbon club. What does that look like? And this is a conundrum for Japan. Right? Japan was never a really big fan of the German proposal in the first place. So what does it look like? So this is, this research is instructive for me in trying to help decide what that looks like, trying to discern what that looks like. That's one. The other is the global arrangement on steel and aluminum, this bilateral agreement between the US and the EU, which is plagued by a difference of maybe a myriad of conceptions about what it could finally land on, what it will eventually look like. And there's some some in the US that would like it to look like sort of a common external tariff applied as between the US and the EU on foreign high GHG intense steel, high GHG intense aluminum. But I think this report speaks to some of the difficulties in implementation of that conception of a final landing point for the global agreement, and maybe pushes it towards something like the kinds of product standards that Eileen was talking about as a final point, and then we're into figuring out how that jives with the existing instruments like CBAM. But this research, I think, speaks quite clearly to what the difficulties will be in that conception of a final landing point for GASA. So.
Thank you, sir. Brigitta.
Yeah, first, thanks a lot for the report. I think it's extremely valuable, as already mentioned, to get more informed discussions, to get more knowledge about the whole issue, because I think there are still several lacks. Then one comment on the EEG, which was mentioned. Yes, it is very similar. It is this sometimes called green leakage issue, that production will go there where it can be done cheapest and with the best conditions. But that also means that countries have to prepare to be ready to then provide also the best conditions for green production. And that's where I also still see lacks in the EU. They're putting actually the industry in a global competition, but with not having prepared for it. And if the message in this climate clubs also is the world is going into this direction, each and every country should prepare to provide the best conditions for green production. That would already be a big success, I believe.
You've been very silent, sir.
No, I was silent because I am not an expert of say the Olivier Imbos is senior fellow at ERCST, but having a background of more than 40 years of, let's say, not collaboration, but management of industry. So I do not have these, let's say, experience of the international institution, which is, let's say, quite interesting. But let's say, if I was trying to, let's say, launch an initiative and to change or to launch a product in the market, to launch a new idea. I mean, as a private entrepreneur, I will not start by a club. I will first try to, let's say, make my product attractive. So if there is here a difficulty to implement a club, why? What does that mean? That means that there is not a great attraction to belong to the club. Why? Because, I mean, if you belong to a club, when you have a very attractive product, you are in the competition, you change, let's say, you transform the business model. But here, there is no attraction to, let's say, create green product because the issue is the market. So for the time being, I mean, why should I should participate to a club if it's only to pay for that? And Lucas said that for the time being, I mean, the steel industry should, let's say, work a lot to really create a green product. And that is quite interesting because, I mean, the real issue is not the club. Is the green market could be developed in the fastest way possible and attract all the other to participate to that. So the question is not really the club, is the market.
It's the green market, absolutely. But the club may help to shape that market.
It will help. No, it hinders in some cases. I feel hindered by BASF is also working very much on these markets. And last week, you may have seen that there are big steps now towards having carbon footprints for chemicals clearly defined and better agreed, because that's actually the first step. You need this allocation before you can then clearly sell a product. We have now, sometimes it's really some companies, they divide their emissions through the tons, and then by that way have a carbon footprint that is totally different than having real allocation methodologies. And that's what we actually worked on. But the clear incentive for doing it is really then being able to provide green products to customers. But still, you need those customers who are willing to pay. And with the CBAM, it is you want to force people to pay.
And pay maybe too.
Yeah, but that is really, if you talk about funding, then what I hear is if you have higher income from green products, but the project is funded, then it's sort of not your value which you earned, and that is deducted from the funding. So where is the incentive then to develop markets if funding programs are at the same time asking to deduct it again? Same for companies not working on that. And that these are steps where I really see that it would work if there would be a global rollout, yes, but it's not a global rollout. It's a European rollout so far, and that has shortcomings which have negative interaction with market development.
Look at the solar panel. Not an issue to belong to the club. I mean, the club was, let's say, created by the market. I mean, the Chinese, which were not in 10, 20 years ago, now are the leader, because there is a product, there is something which is quite interesting, there is a market. And I'm sure that India will do the same. So I do not have, let's say, an issue about there is some region which are less, let's say, advanced in that. If there is really the possibility to, let's say, have a market, they will change.
Okay. But that's on product level then.
Yeah, that's in product level.
Progress, which is rather on product level than on national or company level. Like we do have some customers which announced we are willing to pay more for green products and we will buy it from you, so go ahead with it. But that's then really more company and product specific than national clubs.
Is it the club, is the market shaping the club or the club shaping the market?
No, but it's always something which is not, let's say, unique. But at least, I mean, if you do not have the market, you will never have the club. So we could do what you want. We could do, let's say, have a network club. You could have, let's say, a very selected club. It will not work if we do not have the product. If you do not have the market, nobody will like to enter.
And on those words, I think that, again, from our side, it is hopefully something that has put a little bit of order and discipline and helped the debate. It is not easy, and I'm not sure that we've come out to the conclusion. I mean, we had our own conclusion, but people will take it where they want to take it. But it is never, we think it is a contribution and discussion. Our contribution continues, and there's one more report in this cycle of what we do, and then we're starting, as we mentioned, this very large project that lasts for 2.5 years. And also, as you will see, some of you have received invitations that we will hold a number of events together with the World Economic Forum, also on the issue of trade and climate change. So don't go away in this, we love the topic, and this is not a club, but it's a heck of a good team. So, maybe it will become a club. I don't know yet, but it is anyway. I want to thank my colleagues, all of them that are here, and all of them have contributed in their own way. And it's a fascinating conversation. I mean, you guys, we should sell tickets sometime. It is a fascinating conversation between all of us. And I really, it's part of the, for me, I have to confess, it's part of the pleasure of being part of ERCST because it gives me the opportunity to work with people like this. So thank you all very much. Thank you all for being here. Some of you seeing you, it's a pleasure. And some of, and Tim and Eileen being on the screen. Makabe was not available today, but it will be available on other occasions. So I hope that he manages a good inter-African agreement for investment. So thank you very much. It was, and stay tuned. Thank you.
Thank you.